Hey everybody, KMO here. I want to share something today that I saw on Reddit. There are two subreddits that come up most often in my notifications. One is r singularity and the other is r stupid poll, or maybe I should say stoop id poll, which is to say stupid identity politics. This is ongoing criticism of identity politics from a Marxist perspective. As I'll say many, many times, I'm not a Marxist in the same way I'm not a Buddhist. I have sympathy with a lot of their core tenets. Um, I'm just not a joiner, I guess. No, there are other reasons not to be a Buddhist, and certainly not to be a Marxist, other than, just a quirk of one's own personality. But somebody posted the following today.
Is social media siphoning the spontaneous energy that would otherwise be spent on real-world revolution? I keep coming back to this idea, and I wanted to share it. The hypothesis is this. Because social media has become our number one means of engaging with the public, it has also become the environment in which we vent energy that could be spent on riots, rebellion, and ultimately revolution. For example, consider what happened when the Supreme Court overturned Roe v. Wade. How did progressives respond to losing massive ground in one of their most sacred issues? They held a few protests and marches, and they sent 100 million angry tweets. There were no real-world consequences, and there probably never will be. Their problem wasn't that they weren't angry enough, but that they were angry online. Or consider leftism at large. There is no denying that socialism is more popular with the youth today than it was when Occupy happened. In my own estimation, the youth is a lot angrier today than it was in 2011, and the economic situation is more dire. So why hasn't there been a second Occupy? Why is it seemingly more difficult to organize mass movements, despite us being more connected than ever? Revolution has become something we daydream about, not something we work towards. I'm proposing that this is because we are interfacing in an environment incapable of hosting a revolution. We are all anonymous, and the product of past discussions are wiped clean each time we refresh our feeds.
So, is the fact that is social media just an outlet for our anxiety and frustration that prevents us from causing trouble, from rocking the boat? I imagine it plays a role, but it's not a single cause by any stretch. I mean, it's not a single explanation for why we don't riot. And I just want to say the original poster said, yeah, this keeps people from rioting. Good. Rioting is not helpful. I mean, if you're going to overthrow the government, particularly of a big, complicated, technocratic government with distributed power centers and an unprecedented military, including the world's largest nuclear arsenal, you need a plan. You need to have something in mind for what you're going to replace it with. You can't just say, okay, anger has reached a sufficient level, start again, new government. That's silly. So, some people were saying, maybe we don't stage a revolution because we're comfortable. And then somebody said, relatively comfortable. Obviously, there's a gradation. There is inequality, even in rich nations. And there are people who, are psychologically stressed, always living on the edge, not being able to raise $400 to cover an emergency, that sort of thing. And then invariably, somebody makes this comment.
Relative comfort. You mean absolute. The safest, most comfortable time in history and its domesticated products. You are not relatively comfortable if you live in the first world. You are the pinnacle.
And this comment really just means, I hate America. If you're an American or, a citizen of an American toady country, fuck you, I hate you, is really all this says. Because, remember, this is a Marxist forum. This is a forum for, ideally, people who think that working class solidarity and solidarity between the working class in various nations should take precedence over national citizenship. So this whole idea that if you live in the United States or in one of its client nations, you suck, fuck you, you don't get to complain about anything. There's no such thing as inequality for you. what does that do for the Marxist cause? What does that do, for just the cause of making the world a better place? To say, you evil citizens of empire, you can't complain, you have no basis for complaint, period, because you're in the first world. And you know what? People hear first world and third world, and they've heard third world so many times and had it associated with images of poor, dark people, they think it just means poor countries. That whole first, second, third world vocabulary needs to be retired because it's a Cold War reference. The first world was the United States and its allies in opposition to the Soviet Union. The second world was the Soviet Union and its satellites in opposition to the West. And the third world were the unaligned nations, the ones that didn't take a side, and we didn't really care that they didn't take a side, yes, because they were poor. But being unaligned doesn't necessarily make you poor, and being aligned with either the first or the second world doesn't make you rich. Wealth is not part of the definition of those terms. Okay, so the Soviet Union collapsed 30 years ago. Let's just retire that whole first, second, third world lingo. It's not helpful anymore. All right. Back to the topic of why we don't riot, why we don't overthrow the government, why we don't demand anything better. Here's another comment to think about.
I think it's mostly because people are old and fat. The most violent demographic, which is also going to be your soldiers, revolutionaries, criminals, reformists, is 15 to 30-year-old men. If you want to be hyper-reductionist, you could say the chief aim of a stable society is the ability to keep young men productive and in check until they age out of it. The U.S. is less reliant on productive young men, so it is content to keep them down. I don't think we've ever had a more effeminate, depressed, fat, inactive cohort in that demographic. Pair it with extended adolescence, dependency on higher education, lack of in-person relationships, cratered social trust, and a generally negative outlook on life, and it's clear the U.S. is far from any real civic conflict.
Okay, I've spoken to this topic many times, but not recently. So if you don't remember me saying it, or if you're new around here, yeah, it is young men who will do most anything, for status, for appreciation, and to get laid. They will put their lives on the line in ridiculous stunts just to show people, hey, look at me. I'm willing to risk my life for attention. Young men. They are willing to do crazy things. Their higher brain functions haven't solidified until age 25. They're risk takers. They're daredevils just by their nature. And every society has had its way of controlling that, of keeping the young men occupied with something useful, or even something not useful but not destructive. So, one thing to do, the sensible thing to do, I think, and this is what like the Amish do and other agrarian communities, you marry them off early so that sexual frustration is not an issue, and you put them to work, and you give them some responsibility. I mean, you don't leave them just as sort of useless appendages to the family and to the society well into their 20s. No, you put them to work, and as soon as they show competence at something, you give them more to do, and you give them more responsibility, and you turn them into adults early. That's the smart way to do it. There are other options, though, and I'm not knocking them. Sports. Put them out on the pitch, put them out on the field, put them out on the diamond, and put them into symbolic, like play acting warfare with other tribes, other teams. They'll get really into it. And you know what? Older adults, particularly the parents, but even other people who are not parents, they love it too. They love to cheer them on. They love to watch. They love to, congratulate them in their victories and console them in their losses. I am not dissing sports. And the older I get, the less patience I have for reflexive anti-Americanism and for smart people who think that they're too smart for small talk and they're too smart for sports. You don't have to be interested in sports. There's nothing wrong if you're not interested in sports, but making a show of it, that's immature. Anyway, yeah, young men, more effeminate than ever before. I'm not going to touch that, at least not I'm not going to delve into that. I am going to say I think that endocrine disruptors in industrial products, in everything, in the environment, is a real thing. It you know the dropping sperm counts, the dropping testosterone levels in men. This is a documented thing. I'm not going to make a big deal of it, and I'm certainly not going to make an ideological point about it. So moving on. Yeah, computers. Video games, I think, are more of a distraction and a sidelining mechanism for young men than social media. Yeah, I know there are a lot in total number of young men who really get into ideological battles online, but compare that to the number of young men, who spend hours a day at their video game console. I think the people doing battle online are probably a minority. I think they're certainly the smaller faction. And video games, I mean, what do? They give you a modicum of challenge, and it is an increasing challenge. So you can play it until you hit a point of difficulty, that is right at that point that induces the flow state, which is to say it is a significant challenge. It calls upon you to draw upon, your skill and your attention, to focus your attention, to keep your energy up. At the passage of time, you lose track of time. Time just flies when you're in this state. Video games are ideal for inducing this state, which means they're super attractive. And, you can play as a big stud. You can play as a woman if you want to. I've played many a Soul Calibur battle, in the guise of Song Mina, who was my character of choice. Um, you know, you can get all of the markers of reproductive success, victory in battle. You are that man that the woman looks to and thinks, yeah, I want to have his babies. Video games give you that without, the actual sex or the actual babies. Check out this cartoon that was on the Singularity subreddit.
Don't worry, baby. You don't need to go to work or leave the house anymore. Just be a good boy and let robot mommy care for all of your physiological, psychological, and sexual needs while your species slowly goes extinct.
And finally, in a post-industrial world, we don't need a lot of young men. We don't need, to keep the marketplace humming. We don't need muscular strength combined with the hand-eye coordination and just the general knowledge of the world that a young man brings to the job. Women are better for office work. They're easier to manage. They're easier to control, particularly, before the age of 30. They don't have this reflexive need to challenge authority the way young men do. So, college is overwhelmingly favorable to women now. Women are, they outnumber men in college by a significant degree. They outnumber young men, in the workforce, particularly in, the cities and the places where high tech is the major industry. Women are just preferred. And yeah, we also live in an environment where it's not the same throughout the nation, but here, I've mentioned that there's a homeless couple who are younger than me who are living in an old beat up trailer in our front yard. It wasn't my choice. I didn't offer them that. It was my mother who made that decision, but it's her trailer, it's her yard, it's her decision, and I'm not going to complain, to her or to them. And I certainly don't begrudge them a place to live. I'm not going to be that guy. But here in Arkansas, I've heard lots of stories of people who are homeless, but they don't panhandle, they don't sleep on sidewalks, they stay out of sight. And I think it's because around here, to be poor and working is honorable, but to be poor and not working is disgraceful. I'm not saying it's disgraceful, objectively. I'm saying according to the local, ethos, it is contemptible. And so the homeless people hide themselves. They're not on display like they are in big cities. And they don't get the services that they get in big cities. So, they get along, they find a way. We live in a time of unprecedented abundance. And, even with no job, even with no place to live, even with limited transportation options, there's plenty to eat. It's your dignity that's really, on the line. Anyway, I've strayed from the topic at hand. Why not? Why do we not overthrow the government? Why do we not rebel? Because we have it pretty good. You got to admit, we have it pretty good by historical standards, and certainly by prehistorical standards. And also, I think most people recognize that revolutions, they tend to replace the old order with something just as bad, if not worse. You know, the people who are willing to put their bodies on the line out there on the, on the ramparts, they're not the ones who are going to be in charge afterwards. The ones who are going to be in charge are the scheming, manipulative, opportunistic motherfuckers. You know, chaos is a ladder. Create chaos and you're not going to usher in an era of justice and peace and equality. You're going to make room for a tyrant, invariably. And I think most people realize that. But I think more importantly, because we are an aging society, because we're not reproducing ourselves, because I don't know exactly, I haven't done the math, but I think most of the millennials are past the age of 30 at this point, or they're getting towards it. They're no longer in that group of people. The millennials were a huge generation compared to Gen X and compared to Gen Z. And if there was going to be a revolution, it would have been when they were between 15 and 30 years old. And now that the millennials have aged out of that angry young man, phase of life, the chances for, a gerontocratic populace to stage a revolution, that ain't happening. That just ain't happening. All right, I'm going to stop. Post your comments, post questions. Talk to you soon.